Hi, and welcome back to our study on 1st and 2nd Peter. This is the 6th session that we will have in this series, which we've entitled Living in Between. I was thinking of that title as I was setting up the video equipment this morning because I was thinking about what it would be like to live in two different locations. Some of you do that. You have a beach home or a mountain home, and you spend part of the year there and then part of the year in your, I'll call it before, your normal home. Other people have homes in two different countries. Actors, celebrities of different kinds, athletes, people who work for government often leave their home, their primary home, and they have a residence in another part of the world. I think that would be very difficult for me because when we are in one country, the rules and the way of doing things can be very different from another country. My wife and I enjoy watching British crime dramas. And we're dealing there with driving on what we would consider to be the wrong side of the road, a different system of money, a number of different things that are very different from the culture that we live in here. And it's possible, likely, that if we were to try to split our time between two different places like that, we would find ourselves to be somewhat confused at times and forgetting things that we were supposed to do. It wouldn't be easy. In a sense, that's what Peter is talking about in this letter. He's reminding his readers that while they are living here on earth, at the same time, this is not their permanent home. It's a place where we fulfill our responsibilities. It's not a place where we just shrug off and say, oh, well, I'm going to go to heaven someday. But we are citizens of heaven. We do belong to the kingdom of Christ. And so those two things need to be balanced in the sense that we need to learn to live as citizens of heaven while we're here on this earth. And sometimes that can bring a lot of tension. Now, Peter is going to be doing what some people call vision casting in the rest of this book. Vision casting is setting out a set of goals, a direction for where an organization wants to go. And what Peter is doing, after introducing the salvation that we have and the holiness of God and God's plan for us as his people in the first chapter and a half of this letter, he begins to, what I'll call vision cast, how we are to live here on earth in the difficulties, with the difficulties that may come because of the fact that we are believers and how we deal with them. So let's read verses 13 through 17 of chapter 2, and we'll look at this for a few moments. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." Some translations take the first two words, be subject, and they translate it submit. That's what it means. And that's one of those words that kind of makes people raise their head, because submission is something that's very difficult. And I think it's especially difficult for those of us who live here in the United States and countries like it, where we have a relative degree of freedom. We do not like people telling us what to do. We don't like people having control over our lives. And when it comes to the issue of government and governmental control in our lives, boy, some real interesting discussions can take place as we try to navigate how we go about living in subject to a government when there are things about the government with which we disagree. Obviously, authority can be abused. And I find that whatever area of submission we talk about, whether it be here in the government sense that Peter's talking about in this section, or as he gets to the subject of the home or workplace or wherever we find ourselves, we find ourselves often saying, okay, I understand that the Bible says I'm to submit, but then we say this, but what if? And we have a series of questions on, are there times when we don't do that? It's something that comes to mind very quickly. And we're going to find that Peter doesn't address those contingencies. He lays out a general principle of why we're to be subject to our government. And the reason is verse 15, where he says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And then in verse 15, he says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. We are to submit to our government for the Lord's sake. Now, we live in relative freedom here in the United States. I wonder how long that will continue. I wonder if there will be a time in the not-so-distant future when we find more government intrusion into our freedom of worship and the way we go about living. There are things happening in countries close to us and even in our own country where it becomes more and more difficult to worship faithfully and openly without finding ourselves in a place of conflict. The people Peter wrote to, however, faced situations that were often more difficult than just that growing discomfort with the way that government was dealing with them. To confess Christ as Lord and King was a direct conflict with confessing loyalty to the emperor. One of the ways in which this was done, and we've seen this as Pastor Dave has taken us through the 7 letters to the churches in the book of Revelation, is that many people belonged to trade guilds like labor unions, and they had idols, and there were idol feasts that often got way out of control morally. But one of the things that happened at many of these idol feasts was that each worker was required to take a pinch of incense and offer it up as a sacrifice and confess that Caesar was Lord. Well, for a Christian to do that would be a conflict, and so many of them didn't do it. And as a result, that could have an impact upon their ability to maintain a livelihood. Christians were accused of being cannibals in the 1st and 2nd century because people didn't understand when they heard them talking about eating the flesh and drinking the blood of the Lord. And we can understand that. That would sound weird to someone who's not in the know. But they were considered cannibals. They were often accused of making trouble by the Jewish leaders, who themselves were sometimes persecuted. The Jewish people were sometimes persecuted, but in many cases they had worked out an uneasy truce with the Roman government, and so they reported upset when Christians came into a synagogue and began to preach the gospel. There was often tension and conflict where they got in trouble with local authorities. And to say that there was only one God just flew in the face of Greco-Roman culture. If you go back in your mind to when you were in junior high, probably, or high school, you remember the gods and goddesses that were part of the Greek and Roman system. And to confess that there was only one God, the true God, Jehovah, the Lord Jesus Christ, flew in the face of the surrounding culture. So Christians were set apart as being strange people, in some cases troublemakers, and as a result, they faced more difficulty than we might in our day today. And that might change, but that was the fact of it. For them, it was more difficult to live as a Christian. And so, as a result, they faced sometimes localized persecution, but sometimes the persecution was more regional than just local. Sometimes the persecution was severe. Other times it was not as severe. But they faced persecution. And just a simple reading of the history of the church in the first couple centuries shows us that Christianity was a persecuted religion. And yet Peter says, be subject to the Lord, to every human institution. Submit to authority. Now, I'll go back to that question I asked a few minutes ago. When we talk about submission, the idea that is brought up is often the question, but what if? And I think we come to a point where we often ask, well, where do we draw the line? If the government began to intrude more and more into our worship, in the sense that they began to have more regulations for the way we conducted worship, more regulations for taxes, for example, on churches and things like that, what would we do? How would we function? Suppose that the government said that churches were open to people, but homes could not be used for religious gatherings of any more than 8 people. What would we do? We have to answer questions like that, perhaps, down the road. And so we ask, well, where do we draw the line when it comes to submission to government? And I'll give you a definitive answer. I don't know. I don't know where we draw the line. Are there times when we're not obligated to submit to government authority? And obviously, yes, that there are times when we're not obligated to submit to our government because the government is not ultimate authority. But we have to be careful when we begin to draw that line in the sand between being submissive and being rebellious with regard to government. There's an article that I came across on a blog entitled Gentle Reformation, that was written back in April of last year. Let me read a few sentences that probably say it better than I can. There are times, the author says, when as Christians we need to disobey our government authorities, for example, Acts chapter 5, verse 29, but it is only when they require us to be disobedient to God, when the only way we can obey them is to be unfaithful to God. For the Christian, civil disobedience doesn't arise out of patriotic flag waving while holding the Bill of Rights. It doesn't arise out of anti-government sentiment or political leanings. It doesn't arise because we're inconvenienced by the law or draconian measures. It doesn't arise out of some macho sense of being able to stick it to the man. And here's a key sentence. For the Christian, the only motivation for civil disobedience is a deep biblical conviction that obedience to man would be disobedience to God. And then listen to this. And when an informed conscience demands such disobedience, we must also receive the consequences. That's quite a statement. In other words, he's saying, yeah, there are times when it would be appropriate for us to disobey our government, but those times should be characterized only by causing us to be disobedient to God, and we need to be willing to pay the consequences for our actions. In the main, because most of us don't face those kinds of decisions, in the main, we're to be responsible citizens and be submissive to our government. God has put in place the people who are in leadership in our country. We may not like what's happening in the present administration. We may not like what happened in the previous administration. We may not like anything that's happened in any administration as long as we've been alive. But our responsibility is that unless we are prevented from worshiping God, unless we are caused to disobey God, then our responsibility is to be submissive to government, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who are good. That's what Peter is saying. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Now, I'm not hopefully that naive that I realize that even saying a sentence like, for a Christian, the only motivation for civil disobedience is a deep biblical conviction that obedience to man would be disobedience to God. There are some who would look at a certain issue and feel one way, while others feel convinced a different way. So while that's a good statement, and I think the article is worth reading, I've put a link to it in the notes, just saying that doesn't make it easy. But I think what does make it easy for us, or easier for us, is to realize that God has placed human authority on this planet to keep order. And as long as you and I live here, our responsibility is to live in submission to it, unless it prevents us from obeying God. Now, I want to come back to this passage, think a little bit more about it and what it would mean for us to actually be submissive to government. It's more than keeping the speed limit or not robbing banks or that kind of thing. And I want to look at verses 16 and 17 next week with you. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much for stopping by. Have a great week.